Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, and I am here with my co-host and friend and colleague, Galen Clavio, as always. This is like quite a few episodes now. I kind of lost count, but pretty excited.
Like 9 months worth of episodes
I
now, right?
know.
Yeah.
And we are not taking a summer vacation. So, I mean, I'm assuming you are not off in the summers as an administrator.
Correct. I mean, but I also was not off even as a faculty member. So there's always something going on with me.
Yeah, well, it's funny because one thing that my family struggles with is like, oh, so you're done grading, so then you're done.
Yeah.
No.
Right. Yeah. What do you do? What
No.
do you do all summer? It must be nice having all that time off.
Like, no, they just don't pay. Well, now that I am a 12-month employee because
Ah,
I'm part administration, so they do pay me, but before they just didn't pay me to keep working.
correct. Yes. I'm
So,
yeah, well, I'll be working. I'm still working. I'm doing plenty of things over the summer. Yes.
yes, same. So we'll be here. We're gonna be 12 months. So this we unintentionally teased the topic of this podcast in the previous episode when Galen was telling us a little bit about how the value of higher education, generally speaking, needs to likely evolve, which is something that I've really been having lots of conversations around, mostly on LinkedIn, and actually hearing from people outside of higher ed who are starting to really push this conversation a little bit. And not it's not that it's a new conversation, right? Like higher ed has had a value proposition issue for many years, but I do think that the New York Magazine published an article basically that said everybody is cheating in higher ed using generative AI in their work, and even had a college student who said college is basically just how well you can use Chat GPT. And I don't necessarily think that that means suddenly we have this value proposition issue that we didn't have. It just means that like, we need to deal with it sooner, because the way that AI can be used to support student learning or replace student learning means that we have to rethink what it is that we do. And there's a lot of different angles we could talk about this from, but I think a good starting place might be just to think about like what is actually the goal of higher education and how did it start? And I'll link an article from Inside Higher Ed in the episode description that talks about what faculty need to know about the history of American higher education, that talks a little bit about how those goals have evolved and changed, and we're really in a situation where we kind of need to figure out what that goal might be. And I'm curious, Galen, from your perspective, as you think about higher ed, what do you think are like goals are?
It's interesting because this is such a complicated historical question that hasn't really been evaluated in a long time, I don't think, by the people that are actually controlling higher ed. The idea of higher education as a place for advanced knowledge has been around for almost 1,000 years, and the idea of it being a center, like centers for research, certainly is still strong. We had a long and kind of unprecedented period in the United States, especially, where we had a ton of government money coming in to fund higher education, not just through research grants and things like that, but through like the GI Bill, and the idea that, hey, you go and serve in the armed forces in World War II, and we're going to give you an education that you would have never had a chance at getting to because colleges were way too exclusive back in the first half of the 20th century and prior to that. And colleges and universities gladly went along with that because it meant a ton of money. It meant a ton of prestige. It meant you were an integral part of state and federal governments. Well, then that started to erode, and a bunch of things happened along the way. And the problem, I think, right now is that you have in higher ed a bunch of different aspects of the of universities that don't line up with what the original mission was. We have all these student services, we have all these people on campus. Here at IU, we've got close to 50,000 students on campus, which is double what it was 20 or 35 years ago. I'm sure it's the same at KU and at other places. And I think the idea was that, well, the value proposition of higher ed is, well, we teach people how to think, and we're research centers, and yet both of those things are out of step with the reality of why people go to college in the first place. And you have a bunch of people for whom they're in positions of power, they have an idealized version of what they think college should be that doesn't match what most people are going to college for. And I think we have to resolve that tension and that disconnect. And unfortunately, I think for the people in higher ed, it's going to be resolved one way or the other in favor of the marketplace. Because, like, at the end of the day, as much as I hear people have, and I've heard people say for 20 years in my role as a professor, well, we're not a trade school. It's like, yeah, you actually kind of are. You are helping to teach. Why do you have majors in anything other than like philosophy? So don't give me the, well, we're not here to teach people these things or how to get a career, when that's exactly how you market yourself. It's exactly how you market your programs. It's why you bring people. It's how you compete. And unless you're an Ivy League school, let's be realistic, you're absolutely there to get a career. You're there for the networking opportunities. It's why people like crawl over broken glass to get into Harvard or Princeton or whatever. You're not doing it because, oh, I want to go somewhere and think really hard. No. I want to go get a job in the financial sector, or I want to get into a great law school. That's why you're doing it. So as with many things, and if you've ever heard me talk about college athletics, I talk about it in the exact same way. It's like the value proposition in higher ed for higher ed is learn what business you're actually in. We can still do great things in the classroom. We can still educate amazing students. We can still do everything that you want to do as an academic, as a scholar, but you have to understand that you are in a service-based economy where students could just as easily go try to get a job at Google, where they will pay for the kind of education that gets them a job at Google. And that's perfectly fine for them. They're not going to look back or think twice about it. That's the kind of thought process that you need to have. It's like we have a lot of great things at our disposal at colleges and universities, things that you won't find anywhere else. But you need to take those things seriously and not treat them as if they're adjunct to the overall experience. They are the experience right now for most students.
Yeah, I think that there's one of the things that I think is really important as we consider the goal of higher ed and the value. And the article has a really great quote that basically gives five different goals. Like, I think the answer is there's more than one. There's a yes and situation in higher ed. The problem is that when we think about, so, are we just trying to produce people to go toward careers? Are we trying to produce individuals who are well rounded and can be great citizens and creative thinkers, or are we here to help young people move from being sheltered underneath their family's umbrella to their selves and find themselves and become an adult? Do we want them to further the research and innovation within society? Are these the purposes of higher ed? The answer is yes, and I'm not sure we have to pick one or the other, but like you said, we do need to recognize that the way that we present what we do is important for our continued existence.
Right.
So a continual, well, we are here to break barriers and create cures and new technology and understand human society and life and culture. Yes, we are, but as you kind of pointed out, the average individual is not going to look at that and be like, "That's why I wanna go to college." Probably more of our students are like, "Does it have a good student life where I can figure out what I wanna do with myself and who I'm going to be 4 years from now and what job I'm gonna get? Because that's what I need." And it's that value piece the marketer in me will say the number one thing you have to do before you articulate your value proposition is look at the audience you are trying to
Mhm.
bring in and ask them what is it that you value? What are your needs and wants as it relates to our product? And whether you want to look at higher ed as a product or not doesn't necessarily matter because it is one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the big problems with the value proposition for higher education is how out of touch institutions are with themselves. So let me give you an example. If you go to any recruiting event for colleges and universities, if you sit in any meeting with the enrollment management office, one of the big areas that they place a focus on is first gen college students. They want people that haven't, their families have not gone to college or haven't graduated from college. Why do they want that? What's the real reason? Is it's there's a philosophical thing. Well, we want to extend the college experience to more and more people. And I think it's important to note the statistic that right now, today in 2025, only about 36 to 38% of the population in the United States has gone to college. Not gotten a degree, but just gone to college. This is a plurality of people. It's not a majority. It's and I think we forget that if you're in college, if you've gone to college, you forget that very easily. Colleges and universities are clever. They will mask marketing and sales opportunities under the guise of higher education and lofty ideals. But realistically, you want new customers. And how do you get new customers? Well, you have to open up markets that you haven't been in before, which is first gen college students. You also, I think, have to think about the origins of colleges and universities in general, which we largely borrowed from the English. And the English set up universities that were there to teach people how to think because they didn't need to get careers off of it because they already were rich. And they were already like it was a very small group of white male very rich people who that's the in many cases that's oftentimes what people think of as the ideal college population because they're having to learn Latin and biology and all of these things. First gen college student has nothing in common with an aristocratic landed young man from the 1760s. And so when you bring that population into college, they are not there in most cases to get a philosophy degree. They're there to get a degree in something that they can get a career out of. And whether or not, like, the problem is, like, you've got that's your recruiting structure, that's your enrollment management people. They're not sitting there in meetings with faculty who have been convinced in many cases over 20, 30, 40 years of working in this field that, well, we're here for a higher reason. We're here for a higher calling than just like something as crass as getting a job. We're really here to solve bigger issues. And it's like that may be the case in your mind with what you're doing, but you've got to understand, like, your institution has reoriented itself in a way where you've brought in a bunch of people for whom we might be able to get them to that level of thought and that level of interest in 20 or 30 years once they've experienced the college life and once they understand that there's more knowledge out there besides what that first career pathway is. But right now, you don't have that as your basis for a lot of students. And even the students that aren't first gen college students, there's just such a huge disconnect I have found in my career. And I go back to my own college life as an undergrad with this. There's such a huge disconnect between why most people go to college and why a lot of faculty in particular think that they are at college or think what they should be doing at college. And I think that really is the start of it for a lot of people, because the faculty are the friction point. Like, that is where the student meets the institution in most cases. And if you don't have at least some alignment or some conversation about, look, we're in a different business now than we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you're going to constantly have this clash of the perceived values of colleges and universities where your sometimes most important people, your highest paid people outside of administrators, aren't buying into the mission that the university has kind of bought itself into through the process of what they've done in the recruitment process and the students that they're bringing to campus.
One part of me wonders if that isn't partially related to the disconnect that you see between enrollment management, student services, everywhere on campus, and the faculty academic side, right? Like
Yeah.
I got my start in higher ed as an admission counselor, recruiting on the ground 5 days a week, driving across the country and going to high schools. So I organized events and asked for faculty to meet with students and saw that side of it. Many years later became a faculty member, and in my most recent role I'm really straddling the line between recruiting and being a faculty member as a program director. So I've seen it from multiple different perspectives, and that's one thing I think is part of the problem, is that there there's not enough faculty engaged with the recruiting enrollment management process. There's not enough conversations happening across those groups, and it's to the detriment of both, right? Because the enrollment management side may have a negative perspective of faculty because maybe faculty are unwilling to meet with prospective students or unwilling to provide support for prospective students. And they're not getting to hear the things that the faculty are doing that might actually excite prospective students and help provide differentiation points. I do think there's actual, value in connecting with the program itself because let's be honest, how many sport management programs are there in the country? I don't know the actual number, but the answer is a lot
A
because it's
lot.
a popular degree and it drives credit hours.
Yep.
So why come to KU for that degree as opposed to South Carolina or a small liberal arts college in the Midwest or on the East Coast? Why? Well, the why might actually relate to some of the differentiators that you have, and that's your human capital on the campus and the programs, but those aren't always well integrated across. So the communication of the message of value is really difficult when those two sides don't talk to each other. And when faculty don't understand how it's being communicated to prospective students, then we're not thinking about how do we continue that through the model of what we do to retain those students who might get in the door and find out that the faculty don't buy into the vision that they were sold by the enrollment management team, right? Like there's
Right.
a lot of integration there that I really do think could help. I know the problem with that is faculty already have a lot to do, so asking them to also be involved in recruiting is another thing, but maybe it comes down to more intentional conversations between the two sides in ways that are built organizationally. I don't know.
It's tough. I know, and it's tough because you've got almost two completely different structures trying to operate simultaneously in higher ed. Because you've got faculty governance at every institution, and look, there are really, really good reasons for faculty governance. It insulates research and speech from government intrusion, which I know is a big issue at a bunch of places. Um, I also, the idea that faculty have a unique job that creates a special circumstance with students, I think is one that we want to preserve. I think it's one of the great things about higher ed, not just in this country, but in others. Um, but you've also got the financial realities of the universities that people work in. And a lot of the faculty that are now in senior roles as either full professors or administrators, the people that are kind of leading the faculty governance process, quite frankly, trained and matured in a completely different era, an era where state appropriations were high, federal appropriations were high. Um, it was the cost of being in college was relatively low, especially if you were an in-state student. And none of those things are true anymore. And what we find ourselves in now in higher ed is 25 years, really it's closer to 40 years, because this process really started in the 80s when people started questioning, like, why are we spending all of this state money on these institutions who then seem to generate a bunch of people, including faculty, who come out and say controversial things and seem to dislike all of the systems that are providing the money in the first place. And rather than approach that from okay, well, we should probably have a conversation about this and let's figure out a way to moderate things and meet in the middle, there's been a hardening of stances on both sides that has gotten, I think, more and more pronounced, especially over the last 10 years. And now now you're starting to see all these questions about, well, what is the value of higher ed? And well, you should just avoid college altogether because it can't guarantee X, Y, or Z, ignoring all of the things that do happen at college that are really helpful. And this is where, again, it's like there are great programs at every school that do really, really fascinating and interesting things and help to develop some of the best minds and the best performers and the best, other people within their various industries. And there's still great research that's being done. But again, it's like, higher education and faculty in particular have gotten used to not communicating with the public. Like, research is the bedrock of most of what, tenured line faculty do. And yet it's not written for anything other than other researchers. If you're a lay person and you pick up a journal, an academic journal, and try to read it, you're going to stop within like 2 minutes. It'd be like, what the hell is this? Um, and again, it's like, if you're going to use the justification of, well, we do this and this is really important, you need to be able to do a little more justification than just saying it's important. Like, there has to be some kind of an interaction. It's very much a, what am I getting for my money? And again, you're not, if you're a faculty member, and this is a tough one for faculty members to take because, again, they're not used to having to think in this way. And I say this as someone who still primarily considers himself a faculty member. I mean, I schedule courses as an administrator. It's not like I have any great strategic control over anything, but it's like, as a faculty member, you're not wired to think I need to justify what I'm doing other than to my own fellow faculty members. And the one thing that people hate more than anything else being a faculty member is getting reviewed. We hate it when our articles get reviewed. We hate it when we have to go up for tenure. We hate it when we have to go up for promotion. Why? Because we have to explain ourselves. And it's like this thing within faculty members where it's like you go through the whole dissertation process and you have to do it there. And it's like, never again. I never want to have to explain what I'm doing, but it's part of your job. So, there has to be a channel through which you take these brilliant minds that are faculty, and you have these administrators and staff who are trying to keep the financial operations going, and you have some kind of reasonable interaction with each other about, here's what we bring to the table, here's what we're providing, and here's how that fits within the much larger structure of a university. And I just worry that when I look around higher ed, especially at the smaller private liberal arts schools, I don't see the recognition of what an existential threat there is right now. Because if you're like a Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, which has like a top level public, expensive but still public engineering school, you're not in bad shape. There's other schools like that across the country that are small, but they're very good. But like, for a lot of the smaller liberal arts schools, what are you bringing to the table? Like really, that justifies the $70,000 or $80,000 that you're probably charging a year in tuition? It's a lot of money. And I think, so much of it becomes, we need to better articulate what's actually being provided, but also modify it so that it's not just what we think it's important as faculty, but it's what the public thinks is important, and trying to find a meeting point in between, not just saying, well, you need to think that what we think is important because we're experts.
Well, and before, I mean, we live in a world where information is readily available. And anybody can talk about anything on social media or on a podcast, as an example. And so maybe before we got away with that, right? Like, higher education were the safekeepers of knowledge, and we disseminated knowledge to the few that were willing to take the step and get in the door. But now we are not the safekeepers of knowledge.
Right.
Information, knowledge is easy to get. Now, the ability to evaluate whether it is accurate and relevant and reliable is a skill that can be taught in college and should be taught in high school, but can be taught. But we can't rely on I think of this as the because I said so argument, right? Like, we have value because we say we have value
Right.
is not a reason. And it does not speak to people who are spending consistently more money, and tuition is going to go up again. I mean,
Yep.
I don't see a world where we do not continue to see that steady increase once we see grant funding go down. Like, the money has to come from somewhere. And if
Right.
you're going to continue to ask for it from students, because I said so isn't going to work
Yeah. I mean,
as a reason.
there's so many things at colleges and universities that have a tremendous amount of value that we don't emphasize because a lot of it requires you to be in touch with student life, with what students and families value, and a lot of faculty don't, they're not in touch with those things. And I always value the faculty that are in touch with those things. And I've tried my whole career to stay in touch with those things, because even if I don't necessarily like them, or even if they don't necessarily match what I think is important, I need to understand what the people who are going to college and their parents think is important. And the college in the United States has developed into, in most cases, a place where you finish becoming an adult, you you gain access to a wide variety of cultural, aesthetic, entertainment, and other things that you would not have access to if you didn't go to college. And you get to do so with a group of people who are in relatively similar socioeconomic status to you, who are going through the same thing at the same time. So there's a tremendous amount of social cachet that goes along with that. And you get to do it all within the backdrop of a place where you can get your hands dirty, so to speak, in whatever area you're working on. And so, what I always find fascinating, and this has happened at multiple universities that I've worked at, and I've seen it at many others just in anecdotally talking with people. The biggest villain on any campus in the eyes of faculty is generally the business school. Why is that? They focus, their culture's bad, or they're focused on the wrong things. And then you look at the business school and it's like, I'm trying to figure out exactly what I'm not getting here, because they make enough money to pay for themselves and then some. They're almost always highly popular. They bring in a bunch of motivated students, generally like amongst your highest achieving students in the high school level are at the business school. They're still doing research. They're still doing all of the traditional things, and they have their own journals and they have their own metricization of journals, which is actually in many cases tougher than what you'll get in liberal arts. And yet they're oftentimes reviled by faculty who are not in business schools across campuses. And I'm like, well, why is that? Is it jealousy? And I think it's actually more like business schools figured out a long time ago that they have a certain level of things that they are delivering to a particular audience, which is their students and the parents that are interested in them. They focus on things that are easily identifiable as value in the eyes of students and parents: rankings, program quality, job placement, all the things that we have talked about on a regular basis as being things that we know students value and have for a long time. And then they hire faculty who serve that mission, but they structure it within a staff and leadership structure that knows how to coordinate those things. So faculty can kind of operate in their own bubble, but they understand that their bubble is part of this larger culture around the business school. And I think that there are non-business school academic centers in a lot of universities that have figured that particular process out and are moving towards it. There's many others that have not. And I think a lot of College of Liberal Arts or College of Arts and Sciences across the country, where that shift never happened, are going through a real rude awakening, because how do you justify what you're doing within the larger confines of things when you have a comparison point sitting across campus that's hard to get out from under, and you can't just wash it away by saying, well, we don't agree with their values, or we think we're doing the wrong thing, when they're really kind of checking every box that you would want to see in the modern university. That's a hard tension to hit and figure out how to settle down. But I think it explains a lot of the things that happen within the university structure, and why certain parts of it seem to work well and are in step with the modern society, and certain parts of the university just don't fit well, because they're still utilizing kind of an antiquated methodology of even thinking about what they should be doing and how they should be doing it.
I think there's a kind of an assumption there that the business school is teaching people to be profit oriented, right? Profit minded. How do you get out of here and make the most money possible? I don't necessarily think that that is actually the case. But I think part of the reason other units are resistant is because they don't want to be seen as being too transactional or too commercialized or too focused on the money side. So they just stay away from it at all. But there's actually a way to communicate value of what it is you do in your program that doesn't require you to be focused on you need to go out there and make as much money as possible, because there are lots of young people I meet every day who want to work in the social work
Mhm.
areas that don't are, that want to be teachers that are no are not they're not going to make a lot of money, but they still see value in going to college for those things, because there are ways to position value within degrees that aren't related to being a millionaire.
Well, that's the thing. It's not about going and becoming like a finance bro or something like that. It's not about that. I think we're and I think you hit the nail on the head. Like the fundamentalist misconception is, oh, well, they're just selling people on this idea that they'll go there for 4 years and then they'll go get a job. And it's like, well, yeah, that's actually true. Why is that a bad thing? And I think again, if you're in the liberal arts, it's completely antithetical to what your area is structured as from a historical perspective. And the idea that in the 1950s or 1960s you'd go get a history degree or go get a philosophy degree or go get something like that made some sense, because the idea, like at that point you're talking about what, 10% of the population went to college. And if you went to college, it generally meant that you were of a certain socioeconomic status or a certain level of intelligence, where of course any company would hire you. That's not how it works now. And in so many different pursuits, industries are expecting people who will go to college to get a degree in something to come out with training and understanding of what that area is. It's not a matter of, oh, you have this non-applicable degree. You can still get a job, certainly, but it may not be in the career pathway because you may just not have the training required, which is why, and I think this is where universities have to some degree been pretty cynical, because their solution has been, oh, we'll go get a master's degree too.
Mhm.
And that's not reasonable. I mean, especially, I know I've always felt this way in media. The number of schools who set up essentially kind of a resource poor undergraduate program with the express purpose of getting people to then do a master's program. Like, you want someone who's going to go into an industry where the starting salary, if you're lucky, is about $35,000 to go spend $150,000 on a master's degree. Like that to me is where you lose faith and trust in the audience. And I think that ultimately it's a piece of a much larger issue. And again, it's like, I want people to learn about history and philosophy, and I want people to take a foreign language. Like, I want you to be built to compete in a global society where you need to know things and you need to think about things at a higher level. I want people to learn about theory. I want people to learn about concept, but you have to bake it in to the things that people are interested in doing. And if they learn about things along the way that they didn't know about and it causes them to take a left turn, I think that's part of the process and that's good. But you have to have the resources available and the opportunities available for people to learn those things as they go. Because what ends up happening if you don't have that is you end up with a lot of dissatisfied students when they graduate who say that was a waste of time, that was a waste of money. Those are the people you need to be having advocate for the college experience, not sit there after 4 years and say, well, that was a waste of my time. It didn't really prepare me for anything. And that's always, I think, been at the core my biggest problem with how especially public, like big public schools have handled undergraduate education for as long as they have, because they've essentially, in many cases, unless they're in something like a business school, they've thrown away generations of people who should be out there right now saying, no, I had a great time in college. I learned things and I had a great social experience, and it was all part of the maturation of myself as a human being. Like, that should be the value proposition. And yet the people who should be advocating for it, a lot of them don't feel like they got a great experience on the educational side when they were an undergrad. And that's a hard thing to overcome now, 20 years later.
And that clouds, right, the way that they're going to talk about their student experience more generally, even if we know that many students go to college knowing that they might get a lot more out of the outside of the classroom piece, if their in classroom piece is viewed as less than or not applicable or not helpful, it doesn't matter how great of an experience they had, because they know that we sell the educational component as being the most important part.
Yep.
So they're not going to go out and tell everybody how great it was, even if it's just even if they did have an experience that was valid and relevant.
Yeah.
And I've got our solution, Galen. So our solution is that all of the degree programs that are not in the business school need to find where the marketing department is located, whether that's communication, journalism, or the business school, and say, we have a degree in philosophy. How do we explain to students the value? Because I would venture to guess that you could not come up with a degree that I could not tell you how and why it could be valuable for somebody to have that degree. And part of it is because I'm a trained marketer who thinks about value propositions every single day in everything I do. And somebody who's teaching in sociology might not be. So, like,
Yeah.
we could actually do this together, right? To help
Right.
the whole university move forward.
Here's the thing. I feel the same way. And this is part of my job at the undergraduate level here at IU is I have to I have had to, and it's been a joy doing it, find not just the value proposition for each of our academic credentials, but also how do I position them to prospective students in a way that makes them attractive as potential options? And then how do I see the clouds, so to speak, for those students to think through, is that where I want to go? Can I start somewhere where I can go through the process of learning about this? And is it something that appeals to me? And there's going to be some that attract a lot of students. There's going to be some that only attract a smaller number, and that's fine. So I look at it from the perspective of you need to have someone who's invested in the academic programs, but then the academic programs themselves have to invest in the students that are there. And some schools do a great job with this. Some schools, I think, are just now waking up to the idea that you can't just start an undergraduate degree and have it run on autopilot and have the advisors be the only ones that understand how it works, which is something that I see across a lot of higher ed, where like you can't. So much of the and this is something maybe I think most people in our audience know this, but if you're not in higher ed, you may not know this. Like so much of the profit motive in higher ed has been around master's programs because at most universities you only get a small percentage of the revenue you generate off of undergraduate enrollment, but you keep all of the revenue that you generate off your master's programs. So that's where all of the resources go. And yet, your undergraduates are probably the more important of the two bodies in terms of your long-term sustainability as an institution. So it was a really bad idea to, and again, so much of what you find in any walk of life, and especially in education, what are you incentivizing? If you incentivize the wrong things, you end up in a mess eventually. And I kind of feel like that's the thing that higher ed has got to dig itself back out of. We've got to take our undergraduate education just as seriously as we take our graduate education. That's the one thing the small private schools do well, is that
Mhm.
they really do value undergraduate education. But the problem is their programs are so antiquated in the way that they teach it that they're losing whatever value proposition they had. And it's really where the big publics have all the advantage right now if they can take their undergraduate programs seriously. And it actually ties back into the business school thing, because that's one thing that business school programs have done forever is they've taken their undergraduates seriously in a way that a lot of other academic units simply do not.
I mean, strictly just the numbers too, right? The undergraduate student body is much larger. 30 some percent, 35, 38% have a college degree. The number with a master's degree is much smaller. So just like the numbers bear out that making sense. Okay, I think I this is a few in a row where I really feel like we can have multiple episodes on the same topic. But I appreciate you engaging in that dialogue with me, Galen. I think this is something that's likely to come up again as we continue to see how things are shifting with the new role and the new leadership, at least in the U.S. I would love to hear from anybody listening at universities and colleges outside the U.S. or who have previously worked outside the U.S. Have you weigh in on that conversation and how it relates to your experience in how higher ed works in your country. And then, as always, please share this, subscribe, make sure that you get the notifications every 2 weeks because we won't be taking a break this summer, and it's a great opportunity for you to get a little professional development for the summer while you're hopefully getting some rest for your brain as well.
Also, send all the hate mail to Becky. She'll make sure that I get it. I promise. So.
I might. We'll see. Thanks, y'all, for listening.